Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist on Facebook Live. This is where we answer some common questions about atheism, freethinkers, and state-church separation. I'm Dan Barker. I'm co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this weekly show.
And I'm Amit Pal, FFRF's Director of Communications. The Freedom from Religion Foundation works to keep state and church separate, which we accomplish mainly through legal work, but we also work to educate the public about the views of non-theists. And in that purpose, we publish a newspaper, publish books, produce music and literature, but we also do public events to educate the public. And today we're going to talk about Dan Barker's public debates with theists and tackle one of the issues that comes up frequently, the problem of evil. Now, this, Dan, has been a question that's been in my mind at least since 25, 30 years when I read an interview that Bill Moyers did with William Shirer. Now, some of our viewers may be aware that William Shirer wrote this book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which is meant to be the definitive history of Nazi Germany. So Moyers asks him, do you share any affinity with the idea that God died in this century at Auschwitz and Buchenwald and in those trenches of Flanders? And Shirer answers, in part, if there is a God, how could he permit Christians to slaughter 10 or 15 million people? And if there's a Jewish God, how could he permit Christians to slaughter 7 million Jews? And I think that's a question that basically that comes up again and again, and that theologians have to sort of answer. So you've debated, a lot of people over decades about, basically the existence of God and the nature of evil. How do they sort of try to answer that, and how do you counter the responses that they have about this particular issue, which is the problem of evil?
Yeah, so the problem of evil is just one small part of a whole debate strategy, because there's so many other issues that come up. And sometimes I've actually done debates about the problem of evil specifically. Dr. Rubel Shelley down in Nashville, who was connected with Vanderbilt, we did a 2-night debate. It was packed. It was the day after Columbine, by the way. And we did this debate about the problem of evil. There were armed police officers in the audience standing back there because they thought some big event, with a bunch of young people, And so he had his own theodicy. The word theodicy is a word that Christian apologists and theologians have invented, basically, to refer to any defense against the problem of evil. So there's a number of different theodicies that try to answer why there's evil. It goes way, way, way back. Epicurus, his famous paradox, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Well, then he's not omnipotent, right? Is he able but not willing? Well, then he's malicious, right? If he's both able and willing, then why is there evil? So it all boils down to this assumption that there is this creator, this God up there who is a good God. And it comes up, I've done over 130 debates. Including
with Dinesh D'Souza.
Dinesh D'Souza.
Who you have debated quite frequently, and you don't debate him now. If maybe we'll get a bit into that. You've written a blog about that. But Dinesh D'Souza, like me, has his roots in India, and I've kept sort of tabs on him, so to speak, over the decades. In fact, I first saw him debate back in the early 90s. It wasn't you, Dan, it was somebody else. But you've debated Dinesh on this subject also. Yeah, it's come up, when you have sparred with him. So could you talk a bit about that, and we could perhaps see a clip?
So Dinesh and I have we did 8 public debates in as many states. We did, the first one was at Harvard University. And we've done them all around the country, including at that big Baptist church in Plano, Texas, that big megachurch pastor. And I won't debate him anymore because I think his star has Does the word Dinesh mean something in Hindi? Does it mean like a star or sun?
Yes. I believe, and I may be wrong, and I should know this because an uncle of mine is named Dinesh also. But I believe it's something to do with the sun god, and I should check that up.
So Dinesh is he had Catholic roots, but he's a very strong evangelical Christian.
Yes.
Very conservative, Christian. In fact, he was pardoned by Trump because
recently,
Dinesh had committed some election fraud or some kind of
campaign finance reform.
Yeah, and so he convicted of a felony. But anyway, Dinesh and I did a number of debates, and all of these different topics come into it. And we debated at the University of Wisconsin.
Well,
I think it was back 2010.
Sure.
With a huge, it was a packed audience. It was like 1,500 people just crammed in there. And during my opening statement, I mentioned there's no good evidence for a God. There's no good argument for a God. There's no coherent definition of a God. There's no agreement among believers about the nature of God or his moral principles. There's no good answer to the problem of evil. And I mentioned how even Christians have misinterpreted the Bible to commit horrible crimes. And then there's no reliability to the holy books, like the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran. And then there's no need for a God. So during cross-examination that night, the moderator, who was a professor of philosophy, Keith Yandel, what is that his name? Who's written about the problem of evil. Sure. During cross-examination, Dinesh tried to rebut a little bit of the problem of evil, and we have a little bit of a clip of that happening.
That'd be great to see.
So you don't think God could answer somebody's prayer and heal a sick person, Dinesh? Can
I think he could, which raises the issue you mentioned earlier, the problem of evil. Would you agree that the problem of evil says nothing about the existence of God? It might raise some interesting questions about the character of God. In other words, if I had a powerful dad who could do anything, Bill Gates, and everything I need is provided by this wonderful Bill. But then I run into a major problem, and I turn to my dad and I say, help me, and he's nowhere to be seen. Do I conclude my dad does not exist? Or do I say, oh, I got to reassess my dad. He's not quite the guy I thought he was. He might have reason for why he's doing this, but maybe he's just...
I get your question.
Yeah, it's not about the existence of God, it's about the character of God, and yet you used it as proof.
But I get the question. Let me answer your question.
Of the non-existence of God.
You're exactly right, and that's a great point. But to most people, when you use the word God with a capital G, it includes an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent being, a being who cares. That's what it proves. So you're absolutely right. The problem of evil might actually show us that there is a God, and he's just a big pain in the butt. He's an evil moral monster. That kind of a God could exist. If you look at the world, if you look at the hurricanes, look at the tsunamis, look at the earthquakes, look at the disasters, maybe there is an all-powerful, maniacal God. So you're absolutely right. But before this audience, when I use the word God with the capital G, as a name, as a title, we're referring to that God traditionally defined by the Christian tradition as being an all-good being. So are you arguing that there is a God, but he's a jerk?
So here's my point. We don't have the God's eye view of the universe.
So you can see from that Dinesh is going into a particular theodicy to try to answer the problem of evil. Because the problem of evil, I think, even though the problem of evil is not the atheist's most logically strong argument, it is a rhetorically strong argument, because everybody sees, wow, God is supposed to be good, and yet look at all the non-good that's in the world. So what Dinesh was going into, he's talking about the God's eye view. One of the theodicies is sometimes called the greater good. So sometimes in life we have to allow some pain because there's a greater good. And, like I think you would agree that we should not take a needle and poke it into a baby, right?
Sure.
Why?
I think,
why would you not want to do that?
Yeah, most sentient human beings would agree on that.
Okay,
yes.
Unless that baby needs a life-saving injection.
Sure.
Then you will stick a needle into a baby. The baby will cry. Yeah. The baby won't like it. The baby won't understand what you're doing. But you, as the wiser parent, can see the greater good and the bigger picture, and that baby has to suffer temporarily because, you know. So that's an argument that a lot of theists like Dinesh use to try to say, well, God is the wise parent. We don't understand why these horrible things are happening to us right now, but there's a bigger picture for that. So that's one of the theodicies that a lot of them come up with.
And another one, Dan, which seems to be across religions, is the notion of free will. And the reason I bring that up is I'm of a Hindu background, and an uncle of mine is sort of an amateur theologian, not professionally, and quite devout. And I asked him this, that how come there's evil? And he came up with this answer that God endows men with free will, and then it's up to them whether or not they commit evil, and God's not going to micromanage human beings. How does one respond to that? What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, you have to distinguish between moral evil and natural evil. Did you notice during the debate, I was focusing on natural evil, tsunamis, disasters, earthquakes, those kinds of things, right?
Sure.
As opposed to what we would call moral evil, which is done by other humans to other humans, basically, or maybe even other animals, you know. So when it comes to moral evil, then the issue of free will comes up. And I used to preach, and I used to have my own theodicy. I'm not saying it's great. You know, I was an evangelical. But I used to preach that before God created the universe, God was just God. He was perfect. He had everything, you know, everything he needed. But one thing God did not have was someone to voluntarily love him. He created his angels, and the angels all go, God is great, God is great. Well, big deal, right? Yeah. And then the angels are choosing God. It's like if you were on a desert island, there's a man and a woman on a desert island, and they look at each other and they say, well, I choose you. There's no choice, right?
Yeah.
So that God wanted something, he wanted love that was freely chosen, not just commanded. So in order for there to be freely chosen love, he created these creatures. There had to be something other than God that existed. Because if there was only God, like on the desert island, well, big deal, what choice is that? So God had to allow something non-God. Since God is good, God had to allow evil or non-God to exist, which is why temporarily he allows the devil and Satan to roam the world.
Sure.
So that then these people with free will actually had a legitimate decision to make. They could choose God or not. And then those who did choose God, he would know they were doing it because they were really picking him, and he wanted that love relationship, right? That's a stupid argument, but that's kind of how...
So that's a major contention that they make in response to this.
With the assumption that humans have free will. And not even all Christians agree that humans have free will. Of course, the Calvinists say no.
Yeah.
And even Martin Luther wrote a book called The Bondage of the Will, in which case, no, we don't have free will. God ordains everything. So in a sense, we're kind of like the angels. We have no choice. But others, you know, Aquinas and others would say, yeah, we do have free will. If we didn't have free will, then the death of Jesus would be meaningless because you would be asking somebody to choose. If they can't choose, then what choice is it to ask Jesus to come into your heart? So free will is a theodicy that addresses moral evil, let's say. It assumes humans have free will. Of course, the bigger question is, does God have free will?
Yeah, no, certainly. And so that's man-made evil. And how do you account, how about natural evil? How do they account for, say, which really sort of shook me to the core, the tsunami. You mentioned the tsunami back 10, 12 years ago, which killed, you know, hundreds of thousands of people of different beliefs, different countries, you know, across South and Southeast Asia, which is a terrible, terrible tragedy. How do they account for all these children, all these innocents dying in this sort of this natural disaster?
Yeah, well, there's some hard-hearted accounts for that, is that if you're going to have a world with natural law, with alternatives, then that's just the price we pay to be living beings in this universe. That's, God set that up, but and some people, some theodicies say, yeah, that's horrible, but there's an eternal life waiting for us. And when you compare this brief existence of ours with the pain and the suffering, with the eternal life forever, that basically reduces to nothing. because then we're going to have this afterlife. So you hear that theodicy like, hey, we just got to lump it right now because there's an eternal future that comes.
And at the fringe, aren't there people who say that they weren't devout enough or believing enough, which is very confusing because in this case, there were Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, non-believers, everybody sort of, it cut such a wide swath across, these countries that they would belong to different belief systems and no belief system. So that didn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, because people are looking for a reason.
Exactly.
Some pattern to this.
Exactly.
There are some people like Pat Robertson who think the hurricanes were actually God's punishment against a bad, So the earthquake happened and the tsunami happened because God was mad at us.
That's what I was getting at,
Which actually is what you find in the Bible.
Yeah.
If you read the Hebrew Bible, the pestilence and the earthquakes and the fire and the starvation and the famine and the wars were all because God was mad with his people. So you can kind of see that mentality. Evil is actually, in fact, when you look at your insurance policy, what is an act of God? It's usually something bad. Right?
Sure.
God's supposed to be this good being. He loves us, he cares for us, he's a loving, caring parent. And yet, the word act of God means something horrible. Usually, like a flood. Like here in Wisconsin right now, there are people suffering because of the constant rains and floods that are happening. So another theodicy to address natural evil is one that went way back to Irenaeus in the 2nd century, but it's been dusted off and perfected by a philosopher, a theistic philosopher named John Hicks, that's called soul building. Or character building. So God is allowing these things to happen in our lives, and when the horrible things happen to you, then, your kid runs out in the street and gets run over, right? Oh, it's horrible tragedy, but at the end of it, you've come through it and your character has been strengthened. So we need to be thanking God for these tests so that we can grow in our character. But in my debate with Rubel Shelley in Nashville, I told the story. So there's lightning causes a forest fire, and this family of deer is trying to escape, and they're trying to get away from this horrible forest fire, and the little deer gets its foot caught in a branch, and it gets stuck, and the parents run on, but then this deer has to die in this horrible flames and agony, right? Whose character was improved? Whose soul was built as a result of something like that? And empirically, you can put to the light of the whole soul-building theodicy by pointing out there's a lot of people who don't get better. There's a lot of people when tragedy hits, their lives are ruined and destroyed, and they don't come out stronger. I mean, I think empirically we can show that a lot of people don't bounce back from these. You hear people say, well, if it wasn't for God, I wouldn't have made it. Well, what do they mean? What do they mean by that? They were going to melt into a puddle or something? So there's a number of these types of theodicies that have come up to try to explain the problem of evil. But what Dinesh was saying, and I know Dinesh is not your favorite friend.
Actually, as you and I would agree, given the odiousness of his views, one-on-one, in person, he's actually not that bad. He's very personable, which is maybe damning with faint praise, but still.
Well, in fact, backstage we got along just fine. We talked about our families, and I think to a certain degree, both of us knew this was a public act. Even though we're both sincere, we know we're professionals and we were invited to these debates to do this public thing, and so and the audience wants to see some fight. You don't want to just have a boring philosophical.
So what did Dinesh have to say?
Well, he's talking about the greater good, the higher. That in the bigger picture, we shouldn't cry about these tragedies that happen in our life because God has this bigger plan that's above it all. So that's one of the theodicies as well. But you saw my response was that the problem of evil doesn't disprove that there's a God. It could mean that there is a God who is a bad God, an evil God. Like I think some Buddhists and Hindu have a concept of he's beyond good and evil. Right?
Yes, and that's the other rationale that my uncle offered to me over the phone when I spoke with him. Exactly. That God is almost a metaphysical, abstract concept. He's neither this nor that, not this, not that. So then you sort of get him as this abstraction that doesn't prove anything at all, I suppose. So that's the reasoning he had, the other reasoning that he had. I don't know how one can even start to respond to that.
Did you ask him about that? I mean, because it would paint God, if he exists, as really uncaring. I mean, if there's human suffering,
yeah,
if horrible things happen,
sure.
You know, like when the kid runs out in the street and gets run over and the family's like distressed, then this God doesn't even care. I mean, what's the point of even having
Yes, if he's such an abstraction and so sort of, just floating in ether, then I'm not sure what point is there exactly to having such a God exist. But that's the Hindu sort of, philosophical, abstract kind of answer, I suppose.
And yet they pray to this God, right?
Yes, of course, very much so. They make him sort of human, much more than even most other religions, and sort of, pray to him in various forms. Absolutely.
And they give money to these astrologers
Astrologers, godmen, exactly.
And there must be some God purpose to this whole...
Exactly.
But that made me think, the kid running in the street, if this theodicy about soul building or character building, if that's really true, right? God allows these things to happen to us so that we can come out of them stronger in the end. Well, using that logic, you should not stop your kids from running out into the street.
Yeah.
Because if you grab your kid from running out in front of that bus, you're denying yourself this great opportunity to have a soul-building experience, right?
Yeah. You're carrying that logic to its absurd extreme.
But most human beings know what morality is, and we know, as parents, you can't help, So most of these theodicies fall flat if you scratch beneath the surface.
Yeah.
So.
No, it's always been a fascinating question for me, and something that's been a conundrum, which to my mind, theologians and theists haven't been able to answer convincingly. Yeah. So are we ready to take questions, Dan, or would you further elaborate?
Shall we go to questions? Okay, let's see here. See if I can figure out how to use this machine here. All right, there's a question. Claudia Carlson, why don't you debate Dinesh D'Souza anymore? Okay. So I wrote a blog about it, which is on our Free Thought Now, blog, in which I went into detail about why. But Dinesh, mainly because what do we have to gain from associating with someone like him? At the beginning, he was sort of a wrong and maybe somewhat nutty conservative intellectual that I thought that it was worth debating in front of an audience, because you're not really concerned about the opponent as you are about the audience, especially at a university. You want to try to bring these points up so students. But then Dinesh got into this huge political stuff, these movies about Hillary Clinton, these movies about Obama, yeah. And then he was convicted of a felony of illegal campaign contributions to try to help a conservative Republican person, who, by the way, lost after that anyway. Yeah. And so, and then I tell the story in there about how he showed up to our debate in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that's a juicy story, Dan.
I can't tell the whole story.
Yeah, exactly.
But he showed up with an assistant who was a young woman.
Yeah.
And we were sitting at this dinner table that night at the home of the president of this Christian college, and nobody was talking to this young woman, his assistant, and so I thought maybe that was his daughter.
Yeah.
And so I said, "So are you Dinesh's daughter?" And he leaned forward and he said, "She's my fiance." And everybody kind of gasped because he was married and nobody knew that.
And not to her.
No. Anyway, I won't tell you the whole story. And by the way, I was not moralistic about it. I mean, marriages fall apart, and if they were happy, and I mean, so I actually went up and congratulated them. Because who am I to judge the person? But it's the hypocrisy of it. Here he is preaching conservative values. And preaching against adultery and against divorce and against all that stuff, and yet here he's living the same life. So, and then with the conviction and for all of that, and with the sleazy kind of political stuff, I thought, wait a minute, I think enough is enough. He can, if he wants to invite me to a debate, I'll say I'll go if you find another opponent.
No, Dan, in your defense, you're not the only one. I remember back in 2011-12 when he really started going off the deep end, just talking about him with this person from New York, and he said, like you, he said that at least through the 90s, I used to think of him as somebody who was not completely sort of out of his mind, and somebody who I disagreed with, but at least could be debated. But now he's just I mean, it's not even worth taking him seriously at all.
I will say though that professionally, he puts on a good show.
Yes,
he's articulate. He's quick on his feet. He knows how to make the audience laugh. His audience laugh.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of great credits to him as a person that he can pull this thing off.
Yeah.
But he's kind of like a lot of other political and religious conservatives we know. They preach to their base, basically. They're talking, and they can get that response out of their base.
Even if he's completely wrong about good and evil.
Yeah.
Even then he can, he does put on a good show. I agree. I've seen him debate, and he does a halfway decent job.
Well, and I also tell the story in that blog about he invited me to debate abortion at the Cleveland Right to Life, and I didn't want to do it. But he said, hey, I'll share you my fee. I don't charge for these things. I do it for free because it's FFRF. But he gets money, so he split the money with me. And after the debate, sponsored by the Cleveland Right to Life, I took the $2,500 that I got and donated it to the Women's Medical Fund.
That's just
to help poor women pay for abortions. So the Cleveland Right to Life actually helped. Right to Life actually helped about 10 women get an abortion here in Wisconsin. So that was. Maybe that was a backfire for him, but that was a fun event too.
Sure. And you should have perhaps let them know, the Right to Life group. No, I'm just...
Well, by now, if they want to read that blog, they'll know it. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Do we have time for more questions? Bruce, do we have time? Okay. So, Tony Carroll, if there really is a God, what about war?
Good question, Dan.
How can an omniscient God be cool with humans fighting so many wars in his name, but then still tell people, thou shalt not kill?
That's a very good question, Dan. And this must have come up, and you must have raised the question yourself. What's the response, and what's your counter to that?
Well, if you look at the Bible, God is pro-war.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, he wants the war. He wants the killing. And if you look at the Bible, read through especially the Old Testament, and I point this out in my book, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction, that God told his own Israelites, and by the way, you notice how much sympathy we have for the Jews, deservedly so. The Jews have been treated horribly throughout history, especially in World War II, and deserve our deepest sympathy for what happened to them. But if you look at their own scriptures, in their own scriptures, they were the invaders. They were the genocidal killers. They were the ones who invaded the Holy Land and kicked out all the Canaanites, complete annihilation, every man, woman, child, and all, at the direct orders of God himself. And sometimes God himself did the killing. So we should not be surprised that war and killing are an actual integral part of the Judeo-Christian theology, because that's what their book says.
But that's not what apologists would say. Is that what they say? Or when the question comes up of war, how do theists respond? What's the response that they have?
Well, theists and even some non-theists, even some secular people might make, and I'm not defending this, but they might make an argument for a just war.
Sure. And
you know what I mean?
There might be in Christianity and Islam, at these two traditions, I know for sure.
And even in secular philosophy. I mean,
sure, of course.
And there might be even debate among our members as well. But there might be times when you say, wait a minute, some violence is necessary for the greater good, right?
Sure.
So that falls into it. That, well, sometimes things are so bad that we do have to go in. I would say, as long as you are exercising the minimum amount of force necessary to stop an evil, you might be morally justified. And legally you're justified. In a court of law, you have self-defense as a motive for even the most peaceful, loving, gentle mother, pacifist mother, can turn into a raving animal if somebody's attacking her kids. I mean, you need to sometimes, I mean, we evolve with, these canine teeth and ripping open flesh. And we evolve with these tendencies to protect ourselves if we have to. So a lot of theists would say, well, war is something that is necessary for a greater good, and so we regret it. But in the Old Testament, they didn't regret it. There's that horrible verse in Psalm 137, verse 9, that says, you should be happy to take the little babies of your enemies and dash them against the stones. It doesn't say, this is regrettable collateral damage during a war that's horrible. It says you should be happy or blessed. You should do this because they're evil and you need to bash these babies' heads against the wall. So there's this mentality out of their own scripture that contradicts this idea that they have this loving, peaceful Jesus who's against violence, because if Christianity is anything, it's that book that it's based on.
Sure. And won't, I mean, if when the Messiah comes back, won't that be violent also? I mean, the second coming, am I wrong about that? I mean,
well, then there's hell.
Yeah, of course, of course. Yeah.
And one of the points I make in a lot of debates is that any system of thought or any ideology that's based on a threat of violence, which is what hell is.
Yes.
Hell is a threat of violence. Whatever you think it is in real life, if it's physical or psychological or spiritual, it's something that you want to avoid. It's a violent place. Any system of morality based on violence is morally bankrupt. Sure. You should make your point based on your arguments rather than saying, you better believe or else you're going to hurt. Yeah. And most of us Christians were raised with this idea that, oh, there's bad consequences if I don't believe. I'm going to burn. I don't want that, so I'm going to put my money in the plate and I'm going to go to confession, you know, whatever. Sure. So, but if you think about it, that's a bad way to think. You would want to raise children to think about moral principles, think for themselves, rather than you better do this or else I'm going to spank you.
Sure, sure.
Is that why you're being good, because you're avoiding getting spanked? Or shouldn't you be doing good for goodness sake? What was that quote you were talking about? The Jews, you know, about World War II. If there's a God, why does he allow Christians to kill the Jews?
Yes, that's William Shirer, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, so exactly. I mean, that's a point that stayed with me since I read this, you know, 25, 30 years ago.
Well, it looks like I hear some music playing here. Are we out of time, Bruce? Oh, Bruce. Oh, we do? Okay. We have one more question? All right. Here's a question from Chad. I don't know how to say this name. Trapair. Sorry, Chad. What do you think the strongest arguments for Christianity are?
That's a good sort of, you know, counter question, I suppose, for you, Dan. And I guess, you know, why don't you answer that and then refute yourself?
Yeah, I like to refute myself.
Exactly.
You can address that question about logically or what plays well before an audience, right?
Okay, sure.
So I think if you're going to do a public debate, if you're a Christian debater and you want to debate me or Amit or another atheist, I think probably the argument that works the best before an audience is argument from design.
Yes.
The argument from design. Look at how, you know, if you found a watch on the ground, you would think, well, that didn't just happen.
Yeah.
It didn't just, molecules didn't, looks designed, it's functional.
Yeah.
And look at the human eye, and look at all that. And another part of the argument from design is also the argument from the values of the initial constants. Look at the strength of the weak nuclear force, and look at the strength of the force of gravity. And if any of these had been off by even the smallest amount, life would not be possible. And yet everything's finely tuned to us. And so I think that's probably, it's not a good argument, because there's so many ways to refute it, but I think that's probably the one that's going to play before the average audience best. And of course, there's all these books. Richard Dawkins' The Blind Watchmaker, talking about that watch,
sure.
Totally refutes how this whole idea of design. And if you even look at a watch, the designer might have been a group of designers, maybe polytheism.
Sure.
or in most of those designers are probably dead now. Yeah. So maybe God is dead. Maybe God started it like
I never thought of a watch that way, Dan. I guess.
Or a watch might have been designed by a company. Sure. But if you look at the history of the design of watches, watches evolved through a system of trial and error too. Sure. Simple chronometers to later, to later, to later, to later. Yeah. So that watch didn't just out of nowhere. It came through a process. Sure. And then you can, if you can at least admit that process, you can say, well, look at how life then evolved through a process.
That's a great analogy. Yeah.
And then, of course, I think the killer argument against the design argument, and Dawkins brings this up in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, anything that is capable of designing something, like a watch or an eye or whatever, anything capable of designing that has to be at least as complex as the thing that it designed.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And if functional complexity requires a designer, isn't the mind of the designer functionally complex as well?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So if that premise is true, logically, if it's true that functional complexity requires a designer, well, then the functional complexity of the mind of the designer also needs a designer itself. And then you get into this infinite argument of where do you stop?
Sure.
And so most of us naturalists would say, well, let's stop with what we do know.
Yeah.
Instead of inventing needless hypotheses, let's stop with what we do know about what works in the real world. So I think the moral argument is probably second place. How can we have moral values without
without
a moral?
Often too. Yes.
How can you have moral law without a moral lawgiver?
Yeah.
That's a strong argument as well, which plays well before an argument. But then there's also the first cause. There's teleological is design. There's cosmological arguments. William Lane Craig uses his Kalam cosmological argument, which I think also plays pretty well before an audience. And I wrote a whole chapter about that. Kalam starts with a K.
Sure.
So I call it cosmological with a K, calamity. Okay. It's a bad argument.
Sure.
But it's legitimate.
Yeah.
And philosophers talk about it, and so it's on the table.
Yeah.
Those arguments are worth bringing up and discussing, and then refuting them as well. Any more questions, or that's all the questions for today? Well, that's all of our time for today too. So
yeah, Dan, it was great discussing this issue with you. It's something that's fascinated me for decades. And thanks, Dan. And that's our show for today. And don't forget, our convention in San Francisco will be the first weekend of November, 2nd through the 4th. Do please be there.
And speakers at this year's convention include the eminent writer Salman Rushdie, the former director of Planned Parenthood. You can see her there, Cecile Richards. The Mythbusters host, Adam Savage, there with a big smile. And then there's the actor John Delancey. He played Q on one of the Star Trek series.
Yes.
Then ex-Muslims of North America co-founder Sarah Haider. The award-winning stand-up comedian Leanne Lord, right there in the middle. And the irreverent actress, one of our favorite friends, and the Saturday Night Live alum, Julia Sweeney. Also appearing will be Ensaf Haidar, the activist wife of a Saudi freethinker whose persecution and imprisonment have caused global outrage. You can register for our convention online today. Just go to ffrf.org/outreach/convention.
And if you want to receive FFRF text alerts on your smartphone, text FFRF. That's Freedom from Religion Foundation, FFRF, to 52886. Data rates may apply. Again, that's FFRF to 52886. We'll see you next week for another episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. Thanks, Dan.